by the end of this video, you'll have a bootable USB drive to install Arch Linux or any Linux distro of your choosing. We're going to go over how to do this if you're already running Linux, macOS, as well as Windows. Now, some of the strategies will be quite a bit different depending on what you're using, but if you're on Linux or macOS, we're actually going to be doing this with cat. And if you're on Windows, then we'll be using Rufus. Now, I'm not running any VMs here. I am running native Linux, but this blog post here has steps on what to do for macOS and Rufus, and we're going to go over that on a video here. With that said, also, I will mention that we're going to go over how to configure your BIOS to be able to boot into this drive as well. And just a heads up here too, what's pretty cool is, at least with Arch Linux, this USB drive that we're going to be setting up here for the installer also doubles as a recovery drive. For example, maybe in the future, I don't know, a year from now, hopefully it doesn't happen, you mess up your main system in some way and you can't boot from your drive anymore. You can actually hook up this USB stick here, and then you can boot into it and then chroot into your system here to fix whatever went wrong. That goes way beyond the scope of this video, but just a heads up, this drive that we're going to make will double as both, and it's not doing anything special here. And then also, yeah, if you want to follow along, then before continuing, you want to have a USB flash drive that's at least 4 gigs. Technically, the Arch Linux ISO is about 1.5 gigs, so you can probably get by with 2 gigs, but realistically nowadays, most USB drives are going to be well above 4 gigs anyways. You also want to download the official Arch ISO here. These dates are going to change over time here, depending on when you're watching the video, but here's the 1.5 gig version here. That's the one you want to download. I'm not going to download it again, but I will be making a drive live on this video here, running native Linux to show you the process here from the beginning. So with that said, let's go and get cracking here. I will mention here too, if you're using macOS or Windows, feel free to jump around in the timestamps, or maybe if you just want to see how it's created on Linux as well, feel free to take a look here. So with that said, the first thing that I want to do here is take a look at lsblk. And I kind of like adding these extra flags here. They're optional, but it allows us to see the model column here. It gives you a little bit more information about all the disks connected. Now, very, very important. The information that you see here on my screen is going to be different than your screen, unless by chance you happen to have the exact same setup, which would be pretty coincidental. But in my case here, I have a 256 gig SSD. It's a crucial drive. That is my boot partition as well as root partition. That's what we see up here. Then I have an internal 1 terabyte hard drive from Western Digital. I also have that mounted to data storage. And then I have a second 1 terabyte external USB drive, also Western Digital, mounted to data backup. That's where I have all my backups. And then finally down here, we have the flash drive. This flash drive on my machine is going to be named SDD. On your machine, it might be different depending on how many drives you have hooked up. For example, if I didn't have that external USB, 1 terabyte drive here, assume that was just removed right off the face of the earth, then this flash drive would probably be SDC. But in this case, on my machine, it's SDD. It's really important to get this right because we're going to be operating on this flash drive here. It is going to get wiped and the Arch installer is going to be put on there. You definitely don't want to do that on the wrong drive. So triple check these things. But yep, there it is here. And actually we can do even better to get more information about these drives as well. For example, we can do this ls command here, which is going to list all the different USB devices that you have hooked up here, at least when it comes to disks. And here's that, external 1 terabyte Western Digital My Passport. Notice how it's sim linked to SDC. I definitely don't want to mess around with that drive here. But the one up top here, the Samsung 32 gig flash drive, that's totally the one that I want here, sim linked to SDD, and there it is. And actually, if you take a look at the Arch wiki about just creating installation media, then yeah, it suggests that you actually do it from the ID here because this is not going to change over time, whereas the ordering of these will. For example, if I were to unplug my 1 terabyte Western Digital here, then the flash drive would end up being SDC instead because SDC wouldn't exist beforehand. So just a heads up there, these things can change over time depending on, whenever drivers are loading to different orders of your devices. So yeah, okay. With that said, we're going to actually be using this path here, or at least this path in my case. By the way, I will mention here too that the output of your flash drive might look quite a bit different. Mine is already set up here with 2 different partitions, a boot partition and the installation media. I'm going to be wiping that on the video here. That's why we see 2 partitions here. If you have a brand new USB drive, you probably won't see them. Or maybe you have an old USB stick with some other stuff on it. Who knows what's there, right? There might be 3 parts, there might be 1, there might be something else. But we're going to be operating on the one that has no parts here when it comes down to running the commands that we're going to run. With that said, let's go back to the blog post here because, I kind of wrote some more information out here that's kind of important. Yeah, we kind of covered all this already. But, when it comes to running these commands here to actually perform the actions, I tried to make this a little bit easier for you on our behalf here. I just, set up a couple of different commands that you can copy paste. You only need to modify basically the top 2 commands. So let's start by that. And by the way, this will be linked in the description here if you want to go and check it out. First things first though, yeah, let's export this disk ID. In my case, I don't need to edit this. In your case, it's very likely you will, unless you happen to have literally the same exact thing. But in any case here, yep, you can just, export that and then modify this to be, whatever it needs to be based on, just copy pasting that path from here. So once you have that all set up here, then yeah, you can just echo it just to be 100% sure that it's set to what you want it to be. And then, yep, that's the one here. That is your disk ID. Secondly, now we need to get the ISO path. So in your case here, copy paste that just like I'm doing here, and then modify this to be whatever it needs to be. So for example, I know in my case, I don't have this capital downloads directory. In my case, it is data storage. And then also in downloads here, because again, I have that internal 1 terabyte drive. That's where all my downloads are. So I'm going to do that. And then if you want to verify that it even exists, instead of just echoing that, you can also just stat this here, ISO path here, and there it is. So on disk, I downloaded this ISO file to here. So now that we have both of those in play here, then we can go back to the blog post here. And in this case here, it says that you need to unmount all the different file systems here if they're not already unmounted. So if we go back to here and that lsb command here, they're actually not mounted to anything currently, the flash drive. But if yours are, then you need to unmount them all. So actually probably would make sense for me maybe to demonstrate that. So if I open up Thunar, Thunar and other file managers typically will auto mount stuff for you. So if we go and take a look here now at the output of this one, you can see, maybe give it a second or something like that. Or maybe did I need to actually mount it? Maybe I did. Let's actually mount it then. Sure. Cool, there it is. Yeah, you just had to mount it with Thunar, no problem. So if you go back here, then we could see it's actually been mounted here. So maybe, in your case, maybe you already have your USB drive mounted. We need to actually unmount it. So in this case here, going back to the blog post, I'm going to close this one for now. We just need to run umount, and then we can also just grab this here because we already have the environment variable for this, right? Yours is different, but we're going to be referencing the variable, and the -1 part is what we want to actually unmount here. In your case too, maybe this is slightly different. So let's do umount here. And by the way, I will mention here too that, you can unmount it from the ID, which is actually what we're doing here. And that -1 part came again before we even run this. Let's go and take a look here at the output here. This -part1 here is going to be what's there. And this is what's actually mounted here. So we're going to unmount this. And by the way, this is not like a destructive, like disk breaking action. We're just unmounting it, right? So let's go with part 1. And then we do this, and then that is going to unmount it. So now if I clear this, just so we have some more room here, run this again, and we can see there is no mount point there. And now we are in a good position to actually do the things to actually wipe the drive. So this is the one that's going to be very important. Make sure things are all set up here. Notice how it's operating on these environment variables that we exported here, the ISO path, the download here, and then the disk ID, which is whatever drive that you have. Now, really what this is coming down to is just literally using the cat command. I'm not going to run this now in the terminal, but I just want to demonstrate what we're doing. We're catting basically the ISO download, right? We have that. It's the ISO path. Again, whatever, this is not a proper variable, it doesn't matter. We're just redirecting that over to your disk ID. And that's what that is. But we can't do that with sudo. Like for example, if you try to run this like sudo cat and then redirect to a file, it just doesn't work. So instead, we're actually just going to be using T for this one. And then T is going to both, do the redirect here, in this case here with cat, but then also output it to your terminal. We don't want to output 1.5 gigs of, binary data to your terminal. So we're just going to redirect that to dev null. And then we're also just running a sudo sync at the end here, just to make sure all buffers are written before ejecting the actual USB. So, and we're also going to time it too, just to see how long it takes. Again, this is really important to make sure your disk ID is the correct one. And then again, I'm going to be super explicit here and just echo these things again, just so we can actually see them before we run anything. So there we go, and there we go. So now we're going to run this. It's going to prompt you for your sudo password because we're using that here. But yeah, there's the ISO path here and the disk ID. There they are up here. They're pointing to the correct things. That's what we want here. Okay, so let's do it. And then, hold on, typing my password. Cool. Is this the correct one? Yes, it is. We are copying or catting the left-hand side, yep, ISO path to disk ID. Cool. Now you're not going to get any output until it finishes. It really depends on, what your USB port is in terms of speeds and whatnot. On my machine, it took about just under 2 minutes to finish here. So I'm going to pause the video, and as soon as I get some output here, then we'll resume. All right, there we go. So in this case here, it basically took 2 minutes here, just 1 second less. So everything went well, we don't see any errors, and we're good to go, because really this just redirected standard out to dev null. If an error actually were to happen, we'd still see that in the output here. But yeah, let's go and take a look here at some of our LSLBK here outputs and just see things. Now, in my case here, nothing really changed because, this was the state of the system before I actually wrote everything to disk here. But in your case, if you had something different, now you should see what I see here, basically having two different partitions. We have, the boot partition here, 252 megs, and then 1.2 gigs for the Arch installation files itself. So if I go back over here to the blog post here, yeah, I mentioned that you can run that again here. It kind of lets you know about these partitions here. But now we can actually mount them and take a look here. And you can use udisks.ctl for that one, which comes with the udisks2 package. Again, you can just run the mount commands by yourself, but then you have to make the directories and then mount it and then unmount it and delete the directories and eject this and eject that and run this and run that. Udisks.ctl actually does all of this, and it's pretty nice. So in this case here, let's go and take a look here at SDD2 here. And again, your values are going to be changed. So let me go and just mount this one here. So we can just, mount this one. Cool. Block device, done. And then we can also mount SDD1 as well, just to get the file system here for Arch Linux installation there. And then they're both mounted. So if we do this now and run the LSLBK again, we can see both of them have been mounted. And this is kind of the benefit of using udisks.ctl. It grabs the labels right off the USB here, and this was set up by the Arch installer. So that's pretty cool. So yeah, these are all just set up right now. So if I were to go and take a look at this, and then, we can just go and maybe, I don't know, let's use Eza here to take a look here at the contents of that directory. So yeah, this is all the different files here for the Arch installer. You won't be messing with these things here, but they're there if you go and want to take a look at them. So that's pretty cool. So now let's go back to the blog post here, and yeah, everything is already set up here. And once you're happy with that, you can start unmounting these things. And I'm probably going to edit the blog post to include SDD1 here as well as 2. But yeah, basically we need to do two things. We need to unmount it, and then we can also power off the USB device. If you were to do this in Thuna or another file manager, it's really going to allow you to safely eject this, but we're doing it by the command line instead. So let's go and unmount this one for SDD2. All right. And then we're also going to unmount SDD1. Again, going to modify these for yours here because they're going to be different. And then we can just go back here and just do the power offs. Cool. And then technically, I'm not going to remove the USB stick, but then you would be available to do that one. So yeah, we can do this actually without even putting those, because we don't need to put the 1 or 2 for power off because it's the device itself, it's not the partitions. So yeah, once we do that, now you could actually physically eject this from your machine, and it would do it in a safe manner. So at this point, if we're on native Linux, you are good to go. You can skip over to the BIOS section here, which we're going to go over at the very end of the video here, but let's go over Mac OS as well. Again, this is going to be kind of just skimming much quicker over the blog post here because, again, I can't run Mac OS in a VM, although I am running Mac OS on a company-issued laptop. That thing is pretty locked down, and I didn't want to really run all these steps here and kind of record a video of a work device, etc. But I did run some of them here just to kind of get the outputs of the USB stick. So on Mac OS, commands are going to be a little bit different. You can run distro list to get a full list of all the different disks that you have. Your output's going to look quite a bit different than what you see here. In my case here, there's the internal physical disk. It had all sorts of different things there that I'm omitting for brevity. Not really important, but this one is the one that's actually important. This is the 32 gig flash drive here. It is ID'd as disk 4. In your case, it might be different. It really depends. But again, just make sure that you're going to be operating on this number here for your actual machine here. You can also run distro info disk 4 here. That's going to give you a little bit more information here. It should mention something like flash drive or, whatever labels you might have on your USB drive itself. So before continuing, yeah, make sure you know what your disk number is. We're going to be operating on disk 4. It will be wiped. And the steps are very similar to the Linux steps here, if you happen to watch that as well. So in this case here, we can run distro, unmount disk, and then that is going to be unmounting this file system that you have here. The S2 came from the output here. Again, this is going to be different depending on what you have. You want to unmount all of them if there's more than one. Usually when you plug in a USB drive on macOS, it will auto mount them even without needing to open up a file explorer. So with that case here, you can just unmount that. You're good to go, unmount whatever you need. And then we can do very similar steps to what we did on native Linux. So in this case here, you want to modify this path to be wherever you downloaded the Arch Linux ISO. Again, this file may change depending on when you watch the video. There could be a newer one out. Also, if you didn't download it to downloads, then adjust this path as needed. Then we're going to do the same thing that we did on Linux here and basically just redirect that out to your disk. Now, this R here is not a typo. This is going to do raw mode, which is going to allow the copy to this USB stick to be much faster. But there's a disk 4. This part is what you'll want to change if yours happens to not be disk 4. And then, we're just going to sync this here, which as mentioned previously, but also maybe you've been skipping around here. This syncs all the buffers here before ejecting the USB drive. So it's kind of important to run at the end just to be super sure everything is getting written to disk correctly. Disk in this case being your USB drive. So yeah, this will run, and really depending on your machine, this could finish anywhere from a couple of seconds all the way to 2 minutes. On my Linux machine here, it finished in just under 2 minutes. But yeah, you're not going to get any output there. So again, you can watch other parts of this video to see how this command runs here because that was covered before. But once you do that, then you're good to go. So you won't be able to really read this partitions here on your Mac to confirm the contents are good, but as long as you don't get any errors in that output, then you should be good to go here. Then after that, if you plan to eject your USB physically, as in disconnecting it from your Mac, then you can run disk-util eject on whatever disk that you've been working with. In my case, that was disk 4. Feel free to replace that with yours. Then you can jump over to the BIOS section here because these steps are all the same no matter what OS you're using. But before we get there, we're going to go over how to do this on Windows. So let's say that you're running Windows and now you just want to run Arch Linux or another Linux distro. So technically, if you have WSL2, there are ways to get your USB drive to be detected there, and then you can actually follow the Linux section. But it's probably not worth setting all that up there if your goal is to format Windows and then install Arch Linux anyways. So there's a whole bunch of different tools to do this. Rufus is a really solid choice. I've been using it for longer than I can remember. It's also open source, so if you go and check it out here, it is available on GitHub. You can go and take a look there if you want more details. But yeah, it's been around for over a decade. It has a really good track record. Again, I've used it longer than I can remember to make bootable USB sticks for both Windows and Linux. I actually used Rufus to create the USB stick that I used to install Arch Linux here. Unfortunately, I didn't record any videos or make screenshots of that process, but Rufus is, it's a GUI, right? It's a GUI tool here. Here's a screenshot of what it looks like. And there's all sorts of different options here that you can play around with, but I wrote them down here. And I don't think you really need a screenshot to get this to work here, but when you open up Rufus, one, like put your USB stick into your Windows machine there. Then for the device, you just, pick your USB drive here for boot selection. Pick the ISO that you downloaded from earlier in the video here if you, were following along. Then when it comes to the partition scheme and target system, choose GPT for the partition scheme, and then the target system will be UEFI. And then for the format options, you can leave the defaults there. It'll just use FAT32. I'm kind of curious to see what their screenshot shows here. No, totally different setup. Maybe different screenshots have different things. Whatever, not important. But yeah, you can see FAT32 here. This is actually different than what we want here. But don't worry about those screenshots there. I just wanted to show you some screenshot. But in any case here, after you have all that set up, you can hit the start button on the bottom of Rufus. Then it's going to prompt you about an ISO hybrid image detected here. You can just use the recommended value, which should be pre-selected. If not, make sure you select it. It's going to be right in ISO image mode, and then hit OK. Then it may prompt you about downloading the newest version of SysLinux. You can hit yes to that one. Feel free to read the dialog box if you want. Then after that, it's going to prompt you with a warning about everything on that device is going to be deleted. That USB stick that you configured here up top for the device. Then if you're cool with that, everything looks good, then hit OK. And after it finishes, then you can just close Rufus and safely eject the USB drive if you want. And then finally, we can go to the BIOS section here. Now, this is a funny scenario where it's like I'm recording a video of my Linux machine now. Can't really necessarily show you a live video of my BIOS unless I were to record that on my phone or something, but then the audio is going to be messed up and I'll be holding my phone, etc. We don't really need to see anything in there because the BIOS is going to be quite a bit different for you no matter what, because every motherboard manufacturer tends to have their own little take on what the BIOS is going to look like. So, I did make some screenshots here on the bottom. We'll go over those in a second here, but I just want to make a couple notes here. Most machines use UEFI here instead of legacy BIOS. Even my machine from 2014 is using UEFI here. It's basically just a nice little improved BIOS environment here. It's a GUI with mouse support. It also enables other features like secure boot and more. Now, when I say BIOS, I really mean UEFI or legacy BIOS, because usually when you're casually talking about this, it's common to refer both of them as your BIOS, right? So here's a game plan. We're going to disable secure boot. Then we're going to change the boot order so the USB drive comes up first. In your BIOS, you want to make sure you remember where this is, because once you're done installing Arch Linux or whatever you're installing, then you'll go back to changing that to be the bootloader or main drive there. So when you turn on your computer or reboot it, typically you can hit delete or maybe F2 or whatever your machine's BIOS activation key is. Sometimes it actually shows you right as it's booting up there, but yeah, on laptops, oftentimes it's F1 or F2 or F10. And if your laptop has no F keys, you usually have to hold the function key and then some number. But when in doubt, if you can't find out what key it is, then you can just Google around for your machine's manufacturer and model number, and then you'll know what key to press here. And again, I can't include screenshots for every single BIOS, but here's a couple of them on my machine here. So I have an AS ROC motherboard here from 2014. I disabled secure boot here. There were some other tabs here that had security, and then down here, for secure boot, I just have it set to disabled. Then for the boot order here, there was another menu up top here to the right, I didn't capture on the screenshot for boot here. And there is that Samsung flash drive, the 32 gig one here. I just set this over to be boot option 1 here. Again, it's going to be a little bit different for every BIOS. But then the last step here is to save these changes in your BIOS. Typically, when you exit your BIOS, you have two options. You can save and exit or discard and exit. So you want to save them, right? Now, at this point, if you were to save and exit and reboot your machine, then it should boot up from the USB drive and you'll be greeted with the Arch install screen or whatever you happen to be installing. So yeah, let us know in the comments below if things went well or maybe not well. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer all of them. And yeah, have fun with your new install. So if you're looking to install Arch Linux, by the way, and if you're looking for an environment geared towards developers or really kind of power users, not necessarily need to be a developer, then yeah, my .dot file is here, fully configures a Neri-based system here, supports customizations in all sorts of different ways. You don't have to use it, but it's available there if you want to check it out. So with that said, if this video helped you out, please give it a like. It really does help a lot for the algorithm. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.